B. Bar. Bar. The term bar first appears in Lacan's work in 1957, where it is introduced in the context of a discussion of Saussure's concept of the sign. In this context, the bar is the line that separates the signifier from the signified in the Saussurean algorithm, and stands for the resistance inherent in signification which is only crossed in metaphor. Lacan takes pleasure in the fact that in French bar is an anagram of arbre, tree, since it is precisely with a tree that Saussure illustrates his own concept of the sign. Not only after the 1957 paper, in which the term first appears in the seminar of 1957-8, Lacan goes on to use the bar to strike through his algebraic symbols S and A in a manner reminiscent of Heidegger's practice of crossing out the word being. The bar is used to strike through the capital S to produce capital S Bart, the Bart subject. The bar here represents the division of the subject by language, the split. This, whereas before 1957 capital S designates the subject, for example in schema L, from 1957 on capital S designates the signifier and capital S Bart designates the divided subject. The bar is also used to strike through the capital A, the big other, to produce the algebraic notation for the Bart big other. Capital A Bart, however, Lacan continues to use both signs in his algebra. For example, in the graph of desire, the Bart big other is the big other insofar as it is castrated, incomplete, marked by a lack, as opposed to the complete, consistent, uncastrated big other, an unbart capital A, which does not exist. In 1973, the bar is used to strike through the definite article la whenever it precedes the noun femme, woman, as in Lacan's famous phrase la femme n'existe pas, woman does not exist. The definite article in French indicates universality, and by crossing it out, Lacan illustrates his thesis that femininity is resistant to all forms of generalization. In addition to these functions, the bar can also be interpreted as a symbolic phallus, which itself is never barred, as a symbol of negation in the formula of sexuation, see sexual difference, and as a trait unaire, see identification. Beautiful soul, belle âme. The beautiful soul, German schöne Seele, is a stage in the dialectic of self-consciousness which Hegel describes in the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel. The beautiful soul projects its own disorder onto the world and attempts to cure this disorder by imposing the law of the heart on everyone else. For Lacan, the beautiful soul is a perfect metaphor for the ego. The ego of modern man has taken on its form in the dialectical impasse of the belle âme, who does not recognize his very own raison d'être in the disorder that he denounces in the world. In a more extreme way, the beautiful soul also illustrates the structure of paranoiac misrecognition, see méconnaissance. The concept of the beautiful soul illustrates the way that neurotics often deny their own responsibility for what is going on around them, see ACT. The ethics of psychoanalysis enjoin adolescents to recognize their own part in their sufferings. Thus, when Dora complains about being treated as an object of exchange by the men around her, Freud's first intervention is to confront her with her own complicity in this exchange. Being, être. Lacan's use of the term being introduces a metaphysical note to his discourse that distinguishes it from most other schools of psychoanalytic theory, which refuse to engage with their metaphysical and philosophical foundations. Lacan argues that it is necessary for psychoanalysts to engage with such concerns, for when the analyst intervenes, his action goes to the heart of the analysant's being, and this also affects his own being since he cannot remain alone outside the field of play. Hence it is certainly in the relation to being that the analyst has to find his operating level. Lacan also argues that during the course of the treatment the analyst is subjected to a progressive loss of being, des êtres, as he is gradually reduced to being a mere object for the analysant. Lacan's discussion of being is clearly influenced by the ideas of Martin Heidegger. Being belongs to the symbolic order since it is the relation to the big other in which being finds its status. This relation, like the big other itself, is marked by a lack, manque, and the subject is constituted by his lack of being, manque à être, which gives rise to desire, a want to be, manque à être. Desire is thus essentially a desire for being. Whenever Lacan opposes being to existence, it is with existence in the real, which contrasts with the symbolic function of being. Something may thus be without existing, when it is constructed from speech but finds no correlate in the real, for example the complete big other. Conversely, something may exist without being, such as the ineffable, stupid existence of the subject, which cannot be completely reduced to a signifying articulation. Lacan coins the neologism parler from the verbal noun être, being, and the verb parler, to speak, to emphasize his point that being is constituted in and through language. A human being is above all a speaking being. Bejahung. In his reply to Jean Hippolyte's commentary on Freud's negation, Lacan describes a primordial act of affirmation which is logically prior to any act of negation. Lacan uses Freud's German term Bejahung, affirmation, to denote this primordial affirmation. Whereas negation concerns what Freud called the judgment of existence, Bejahung denotes something more fundamental, namely the primordial act of symbolization itself, the inclusion of something in the symbolic universe. Only after a thing has been symbolized at the level of Bejahung can the value of existence be attributed to it or not, negation. Lacan posits a basic alternative between Bejahung and the psychotic mechanism he later calls foreclosure. The former designates a primordial inclusion of something in the symbolic, whereas foreclosure is a primordial refusal to include something, the name of the father, in the symbolic. Biology. Biologie. Freud's work is full of references to biology. Freud regarded biology as a model of scientific rigor on which to base the new science of psychoanalysis. Lacan, however, is strongly opposed to any attempt to construct psychoanalysis upon a biological model, arguing that the direct application of biological or ethological psychological concepts, such as adaptation, to psychoanalysis will inevitably be misleading and will obliterate the essential distinction between nature and culture. Such biologizing explanations of human behavior ignore, according to Lacan, the primacy of the symbolic order in human existence. Lacan sees this biologism in the work of those psychoanalysts who have confused desire with need and drives with instincts, concepts which he insists on distinguishing. These arguments are evident from the very earliest of Lacan's psychoanalytic writings. In his 1938 work on the family, for example, he rejects any attempt to explain family structures on the basis of purely biological data and argues that human psychology is regulated by complexes rather than by instincts. Lacan argues that his refusal of biological reductionism is not a contradiction of Freud, but a return to the essence of Freud's work. When Freud used biological models, he did so simply because biology was at that time a model of scientific rigor in general, and because the conjectural sciences had not then achieved the same degree of rigor. Freud certainly did not confuse psychoanalysis with biology or any other exact science, and when he borrowed concepts from biology, such as the concept of the drive, he reworked them in such a radical way that they become totally new concepts. For example, the concept of death instinct is not a question of biology. Lacan expresses his point with a paradox. Freudian biology has nothing to do with biology. Lacan, like Freud, uses concepts borrowed from biology, for example imago, dehiscence, and then reworks them in an entirely symbolic framework. Perhaps the most significant example of this is Lacan's concept of the phallus, which he conceives as a signifier and not as a bodily organ. Thus, while Freud conceives of the castration complex and sexual difference in terms of the presence and absence of the penis, Lacan theorizes them in non-biological, non-anatomical terms, the presence and absence of the phallus. This has been one of the main attractions of Lacanian theory for certain feminist writers who have seen it as a way of constructing a non-essentialist account of gendered subjectivity. However, while Lacan consistently rejects all forms of biological reductionism, he also rejects the culturalist position which completely ignores the relevance of biology. If biologizing is understood correctly, that is not as the reduction of psychic phenomena to crude biological determination, but as discerning the precise way in which biological data impact on the psychical field, then Lacan is all in favor of biologizing thought. The clearest examples of this are Lacan's appeals to examples from animal ethology to demonstrate the power of images to act as releasing mechanisms. Hence Lacan's references to pigeons and locusts in his account of the mirror stage and to crustaceans in his account of mimicry. See Gestalt. Thus, in his account of sexual difference, Lacan follows Freud's rejection of the false dichotomy between anatomy or convention. Lacan's concern is not to privilege either term, but to show how both interact in complex ways in the process of assuming a sexual position. Borromean knot, nœud borromien. References to knots can be found in Lacan's work as early as the 1950s, but it is not until the early 1970s that Lacan begins to examine knots from the point of view of their topological properties. The study of knot theory marks an important development in Lacan's topology. From the study of surfaces, the Möbius strip, the torus, etc., Lacan moves to the much more complex area of the topology of knots. Topology is increasingly seen as a radically non-metaphorical way of exploring the symbolic order and its interactions with the real and the imaginary. Rather than simply representing structure, topology is that structure. In this late period of his work, one kind of knot comes to interest Lacan more than any other, the Borromean knot. The Borromean knot, shown in figure 1, so called because the figure is found on the coat of arms of the Borromeo family, is a group of 3 rings which are linked in such a way that if any one of them is severed, all 3 become separated. Strictly speaking, it would be more appropriate to refer to this figure as a chain rather than a knot, since it involves the interconnection of several different threads, whereas a knot is formed by a single thread. Although a minimum of 3 threads or rings are required to form a Borromean chain, there is no maximum number. The chain may be extended indefinitely by adding further rings while still preserving its Borromean quality. In other words, if any of the rings is cut, the whole chain falls apart. Lacan first takes up the Borromean knot in the seminar of 1972-1973, but his most detailed discussion of the knot comes in the seminar of 1974-1975. It is in this seminar that Lacan uses the Borromean knot as, among other things, a way of illustrating the interdependence of the 3 orders of the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary, as a way of exploring what it is that these 3 orders have in common. Each ring represents one of the 3 orders, and thus certain elements can be located at intersections of these rings. In the seminar of 1975-1976, Lacan goes on to describe psychosis as the unraveling of the Borromean knot and proposes that in some cases this is prevented by the addition of a 4th ring, the symptome, which holds the other 3 together.